Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I'm executive director at American Compass, and today I am delighted to be joined by Brody Mullins. How are you, sir?
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Brody is an investigative reporter, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and co-author with his brother Luke of The Wolves of K Street: The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. To be honest, I'd love to spend the entire time just talking about how on earth you get through writing a book with your brother, but that will be maybe in the B-roll. Really excited to talk about this because I think, obviously everyone in the political world loves to sort of lament lobbyists and either just accept them as the price of doing business or have some bizarre plan for getting rid of them. It seems to me they'll always be with us, but how they operate, the effects they have, change dramatically over time. And this book tells the story of, first, how they changed dramatically to take over Washington in a sense, and how we're now coming back out of that, at least perhaps. Wanted to start with the sort of how they took over, because I think, at American Compass, we spend a lot of time on this question of sort of what happened to economic policy, roughly speaking, in the 70s and into the 80s. We focus very much on the ideological side of it. It seems to me there were some new ideas that really affected how people thought about the economy. But clearly there was a lot going on in the back rooms as well. What changed about lobbying? What brought us into this strange new world a generation or two ago?
Yeah, a great question. If I could step back. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Secondly, one of the things we realized in deciding to write this book is that when you take college civics classes or government classes, you learn about the three branches of government and the interplay and the friction in those branches of government that create laws and regulations. But no one talks about the force that lobbyists play on that process. And this is sort of getting into the history here is sort of a perfect way of understanding why that's important. So I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and always thought that companies had tremendous power in Washington. And when we started researching this book, we knew, of course, that before the trust buster era, there were the trusts and Standard Oil and the railroads and the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan, and they were all incredibly powerful in the early industrial age after the Civil War, as the country changed and became an industrialized nation. And then the people in the government sort of fought back and created the FTC and created antitrust law and reined in those big, powerful companies that were deemed monopolies. So at about that point, companies really didn't have a lot of influence in Washington from the 1930s to the 1970s. But for the most part, that was okay with them. Companies were doing well, corporate profits were well, the country was relatively at peace, and the country was prosperous. And during that time, from the New Deal era to the Great Society era, Democrats, and mainly Democrats, were in control of the House and the Senate almost entirely, but also as presidents, ushered in, a whole host of government regulations seeking to help consumers by, regulating the air we breathe, regulating water, regulating prices at some point, and commerce and trade, and you go on and on and on. Roads and bridges. I mean, every big department agency got created essentially in that period, from the New Deal to the Great Society program. And what's interesting is that companies, for the most part, were fine with that. Companies supported a lot of those regulations. They were making money. And so they didn't seem to mind. There's sort of a sense of community where they would support the Little League team and support the neighborhoods, and everyone seemed to be doing well. What changed was the 1970s. Actually, to go back for 1 second, the EPA was created by Richard Nixon, for example. So it was even Republicans who agreed that some of these new regulations were okay. In the 1970s, though, we had stagflation, we had inflation, the economy tanked. All of a sudden, corporate profits evaporated. All of a sudden, companies looked around and said, hey, we're incredibly regulated here. So much of their money is being spent on compliance with regulations that they said, we need to fight back, that these government and agency regulations were part of their problem. So as any smart businesses, they invested in pushing back against Washington. And that's really when the modern lobbying era began in the 1970s, as companies hired lobbyists, started investing in campaign donations to have more say over the rules and regulations that were hurting their profits. That then took off in the 80s. The 80s were a little bit easier because Ronald Reagan was president. And from the early 80s or late 70s, early 80s to very recently, companies have continued to dominate in Washington and had tremendous power.
And so the point that they sort of didn't bother to lobby in the 50s and 60s is an interesting one, because you'd think if they were out there trying to maximize their profits, sort of someone would have thought of it. I mean, to your point, there was a tremendous amount of government activity. There was a lot of regulation. Surely there was essentially a lot of low-hanging fruit to be had if someone had sort of said, we should probably go lobby about this. Was there sort of a mutually assured sort of disarmament that no one wanted to go do that? Had truly no one thought of it? Had it? How do you explain the sort of the peaceful era between the wars?
Yeah, well, I think that there's two ways to answer that question. The better one might be that companies did have some lobbyists. There were a small number of lobbyists, literally like a handful, maybe a dozen lobbyists who represented companies, people who were close with Democratic or Republican presidents and had the ear of the president in an era where power was consolidated in the White House and only a few people in Congress, the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader, had really any ability to get anything done. There were a few lobbyists who knew those people who would get things done, but also companies at the time, any pressure they put on Washington was counterbalanced or counteracted by labor unions. And labor unions back then were incredibly powerful. So even if companies were investing in Washington, and they were in a very limited way, they were facing unions, and they felt like they were sort of like a fair fight between unions and corporations. Now, starting in the 70s and certainly 80s, the union power has been eviscerated. I mean, unions have some influence in Washington, but nothing like it used to, like they used to. So that now companies have a tremendous amount of power, in part because they don't have anyone to fight against. It's just members of Congress are only hearing from companies when they're making laws and regulations. Environmental groups are not as influential as they used to be. Unions are not as influential. There's no big Ralph Naders of the world anymore. So I think that's one way that things have changed.
Yeah, the point that you're only hearing from the lobbyists, I think, is a really important one, and is something I wanted to dig in on a little bit. Is essentially, why does lobbying work? Because at the end of the day, you have, and it goes to your point that there's sort of this almost fourth branch of government in how things get done. But you have these elected representatives whose goal is presumably to get elected again, unless they're sort of outright corrupt. And a lobbyist who shows up, especially, as a registered lobbyist, everyone understands he's not there to actually tell you what is best for your constituents. He's there to advocate for a company. And yet they are very persuasive. Is it just the implicit campaign check on the back end, or how do you explain the sort of the way that the lobbying in fact does end up shaping what happens?
Yeah, so I think it all goes back to money. So in the 20 plus years that I've covered Washington, the one thing I know for sure is that a member of Congress exists to get reelected. And unfortunately, in our system, it costs a lot of money to get reelected, and so you need to raise money. And companies are the single biggest source of money for campaigns, and a lot of that money is funneled through lobbyists. So a lobbyist will represent 15, 25 different companies and has access to their political action committees or their executives. So a lobbyist can very easily set up a lunch or dinner or coffee with a member of Congress and bring in 25 checks for a total of $100,000 or so. So the lobby sort of becomes the conduit for corporate money into politics. So if you're a member of Congress, and again, you exist to get reelected and you need money to get reelected, you want to be friends or at least have relationships with people who can get you those $100,000 donations or $150,000 donations or even more. So therefore, you're going to talk with that person or be friends with them or communicate with them, and lobbyists know that, so they sort of use the lure of the corporate money of the PAC checks to from time to time ask for a favor, or sometimes really just to explain an issue to a member of Congress. And the issue again is that a member of Congress is hearing from several different companies in an industry on a policy that affects the industry, and they're not hearing from the other side because consumer groups don't have someone who's raising money from consumers and handing over big checks. They just don't have the same seat at the table. Only one side is getting hurt. And, back to the beginning, lobbying, petitioning the government is constitutionally protected under the First Amendment. So is raising money and making campaign contributions. So neither of those are going to go away. And we're not saying that the corporate lobbying is, innately bad. The problem is that there's no other side. It used to be that a member of Congress could talk to the company and get the industry side, talk to the union to get their side, talk to the Ralph Naders, get their side, and then make an informed decision. These days, they're only here from one side.
And that is, it's partly a money story. It's partly a lack of the other side story, that unions are not as influential as they used to be, that some of these activist groups, there are certainly a lot of them, but it's not clear maybe how disciplined or effective they are, if nothing else. It seems to me there's also a sort of innate problem of congressional capacity. That is, that in a lot of cases, you have the lobbyist writing the bill because there is no one on the staff who understands the issue as well and even could. How important a part of the story is that? Is there a real decline in congressional capacity as an element of it?
I think that's exactly right. As an issue that we get into a little bit, that, creating laws, the question is, why are there lobbyists? I mean, creating laws and policy and regulations are incredibly complicated, incredibly complicated issues, dealing with industries that are complicated, changing the law is complicated. How the laws even get created is a complicated process. It's not just, what you read in civics class. I mean, there are all sorts of committees and subcommittees and different procedures that rules and regulations need to go through, and how they get in the congressional record, and, this, that, and the other thing. The process of creating regulations at an agency is even more complicated. And companies are business people. They're running their business. They have a successful business because they spend a lot of time and effort and know-how to form a good business. They don't know how the government works or how laws or rules are created. And if they did, they probably wouldn't be that good at their businesses because they're focusing on the wrong thing. So lobbyists are almost translators of, sort of take a business person's hand and say, hey, let me explain to you how the process works. If you have a problem with a regulation on, sewage treatment plants, well, here's the committee or members of Congress or subcommittee who you need to talk to. Of the 150, 200 federal agencies, here's the 3 that matter. And within those agencies, here's the divisions or departments that matter. They really sort of help people figure out how to have their say in government, and therefore are incredibly valuable. To answer another part of your question, most staffers, congressional staffers, because of the pay, which is very low, are junior. I mean, Capitol Hill is run by 25-year-olds. I was going to say 30-year-olds, but that sounds pretty old. There's very young people who are ambitious and oftentimes very, very smart, who are chiefs of staff and legislative assistants, legislative aides to members of Congress. But they can't know everything. You can't be an expert in everything. And Congress creates the laws for everything. So one of the things that lobbyists do, or that staffers do, and frankly, as a reporter, I do, is you go to the experts, and the experts are often lobbyists, because the expert used to work at the EPA, the lobbyist used to work at the EPA, or the lobbyist used to work for the congressional committee that deals with the EPA, and they've dealt with it for years and years and years. Now they're working for a corporate interest, but they still know the law and know the regulations and know the process better than anyone else. So I know I use them as a resource, and congressional staffers also use them as a resource, which again gives those lobbyists tremendous power.
Yeah, and that goes to a good point about the sort of different channels that this happens through, right? I mean, lobbying there's literally the, 2 guys having the expensive lunch talking about something. But it seems to me that much more broadly, and something that you really focus on is the way that essentially an entire ideological ecosystem was created around this kind of pro-business agenda. And, that's something that we focus on here a lot, particularly looking at the right of center. You have what I would call kind of this market fundamentalism that emerged that said, basically markets always deliver the best possible outcome, and therefore we just need to get government out of the way, and therefore you get the low tax, deregulate, free trade, no unions, etc. type agenda. It seems to me, certainly in my experience, that the folks on the right of center driving a lot of public policy over the past few decades really did come to believe this very deeply in their hearts. And so I guess what I wonder is, to what extent do you think that was achieved through direct persuasion versus, you have essentially the funding of the economists and the think tanks and the reports and the publications and so forth. And then you have people who just themselves kind of really wanted to believe it. How do you divide up the pie chart of
Yeah.
how we got to where we ended up?
I think it's a little bit of everything, but I mean, you're obviously describing sort of the Reagan Republican model, which companies benefited from, and I think in part helped create. Um, and I think, we're talking about Republicans, right of center, Democrats too. I mean, companies knew that if they could create a pro-business center in the country that included both Republicans and Democrats, they could get whatever they wanted. And they succeeded. I mean, the country both parties seem to be turning against free trade. But for a while, was free trade more Republican than Democrat? Probably. But Bill Clinton was behind NAFTA. I mean, Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election supported all the trade bills also. So, I mean, and Joe Biden is still very pro trade, or maybe less so than in the past. But in that pro business center was the right and the left. It definitely benefited companies, and companies wanted to keep that pro business center. So they directed their PAC donations to Republicans and Democrats who were in the middle, and kept those people in power. So I think once it was created by companies, they definitely spent a lot of money trying to keep that pro business center together, which is just now, starting to come unraveled. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but that pro business center is coming unraveled at the exact moment that Republicans and Democrats are taking less corporate money. I don't know which is the chicken or which is the egg, but corporate PAC donations to members of Congress are down for the first time in the last couple of cycles. One, because some Republicans and Democrats say, I'm not taking corporate PAC money, which is good on the good line on the campaign trail. But also because we're getting so much money from individuals, that individual money is swamping out the corporate PAC money. So anyway, it seems like things are starting to change now.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about this sort of the new era we're headed into. I guess one more question about just the era we are coming out of, maybe. One thing that I'm struck by is the degree to which you had an entire academic enterprise built up around this same set of ideas.
All
I mean,
fake,
you have,
right?
Nobel Prize winning economists who essentially take the exact same set of views. In your research, has that seemed like something that did develop fairly independently? I mean, like, I don't think Milton Friedman was, developing his ideas based on what lobbyists were saying. Was there just sort of an independent and entirely complementary strain of economics, or were the lobbyists and the companies actively advancing that as well?
One of the things that we discovered is that in the 1970s, when companies felt like they were on their heels and that all these rules and regulations were coming at them out of nowhere, they couldn't fight back. The Chamber of Commerce commissioned a call to arms for business leaders to start investing in Washington. And one of the things they said is that companies need to start hiring lobbyists and opening offices in Washington, D.C., and creating relationships with members of Congress, that to not let the government make policy without their voices. And as part of that, they said, we need to start funding more academic research and think tanks to get their word out, to create sort of that academic research and have studies out there that supported the pro-business positions that you're talking about. So it was definitely by design. I think one of the things we've seen more recently is that companies will pay academics, they'll pay researchers, they'll fund think tanks to try to get, like-minded research and reports and policy and position papers out there, which their lobbyists can then take and go to Capitol Hill and say, hey, it's not just me, this group says that, free trade is good, and here's the study and here's the numbers. And that really helps amplify a lobbyist message. But so much of that is funded in some worlds, like the medical community and medical universities. Such studies are supposed to disclose who their donors are. But in many other cases, like law schools, papers that are funded by a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon or another tech company are often not disclosed. So, I think a ton of that academic research from the 1980s to now, it is funded by corporations who benefit.
So this is all getting blown up, though, and you point to 2016 as the inflection point. You have Bernie Sanders on the left, you have Donald Trump on the right, and what folks are calling this sort of populist moment that has clearly extended seems to have just turned a lot of things on their heads. And I think in particular you see on the right of center a real turn away from the business community altogether. You focus a lot on Kevin McCarthy's comments regarding the Chamber of Commerce late in his tenure were certainly not complimentary. Where does that come from? Is that a response to the will of the people? Is that the lobbyists pushing too far?
Yeah, this is the most important issue. To say exactly when the inflection point is hard, but it's certainly around 2017, 2016. Some folks in the Tea Party will say it was before. We're sort of on a pendulum here, so it's hard to tell exactly where things are, but we're definitely moving, away from that pro-business consensus. And Democrats are also moving away from being more pro-corporate, but I sort of feel like the Democratic Party at its core was always more pro-worker, anti-corporation. And in a way, they were sort of co-opted by the pro-business lobby for several decades. And now maybe they're returning more to their roots. So I find the Republican Party far more fascinating, just because in my whole lifetime, the Republican Party and the Chamber of Commerce were on the same team. And, to see them not in the same team increasingly is sort of mind-blowing to me. I know that you've looked at this more than I have, but, I don't think it's an aberration. I don't think this is just 5 or 6, senators who are outside the mainstream of the party. I think it's more than that. I can't see the parties inverting, but I also could never see Donald Trump getting elected in the 2016 election. So, I think just my simple human brain can't contemplate, the parties reversing, but, more and more of the Republican Party's voters and constituents are anti-corporate. They don't work for big companies. They don't go to graduate school and dream of being, management consultants. They live more and more in rural areas and not in cities. They're more and more in the center of the country and less, on the coasts, which tend to be more liberal. So I really see a huge change here. It's going to taking a long time. And I think if we can fast forward 20 years, we can figure out what happened. But, there's a couple fascinating things to me. One, it seems like every time a Rob Portman leaves the Senate, he's replaced by a J.D. Vance. So you go from a Ronald Reagan, Chamber of Commerce, country club Republican to a more populist candidate, a more populist senator, and that needs to happen time and time again. And then once in a while, you have a Marco Rubio who just sort of reinvents himself on his own. And it just seems like every election we add a few more voices on that side. So I just find that fascinating. There's 3 bills in Congress right now that are supported, pro-consumer bills, that are supported by Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley. One of them would cap interest rates on credit cards. Capping interest rates on credit cards is a fine idea. It's something that Democrats have wanted forever. But to have a Republican senator supporting an idea like that, it's still sort of mind-blowing to me. But that's where things seem to be going. To add one more tick to this, just to show you how bizarre I think this is. About 18 months ago, there was a bill in Congress to basically tax big companies more in order to fund to hire more merger reviewers at the Federal Trade Commission. So basically, the idea was, let's have big companies that are merging pay a higher fee so that the government that's reviewing these mergers can have more resources to try to block the merger. And 39 House Republicans voted for it. It used to be that Republicans were against big government and for big companies, and now 39 in the House are going the opposite way. That's just stunning to me.
So where does big business go? It seems to me it's a very unstable equilibrium to have neither party
right
listening to them. The term realignment gets thrown around a lot in political analyses today. on the view that you both have a lot of working class voters heading to the Republican Party, and you see a lot of upper middle class professionals, business executives moving into the Democratic Party. As you noted, historically, the Democratic Party has been pro-worker. Certainly, labor union heads still support the Democratic Party. But is there a plausible future where this is just the Democratic Party is the party that's aligned with big business?
That is the question, right? I mean, is the Democratic Party the party of the rich? I mean, my wife would certainly say, no way, 'cause she's a big liberal Democrat. But who is the party of the rich? It doesn't look like it's Republicans. I think one really fascinating thing to watch is if Donald Trump is elected, or even if he's not, the big Trump tax cuts from 2017 expire early next year. Those companies, that bill brought down the corporate tax rate on all big U.S. companies. Would this Donald Trump support renewing that? Would the Republican Party renew that? I mean, just this week, or last week rather, the Republican chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee launched an investigation into the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. What is that about? That's what Democrats do. So I don't know. It's really fascinating. I mean, I think this is like the most important issue of our time, and it kind of plays out in antitrust. Will the FTC and the DOJ in the next administration continue to try to crack down on big corporate mergers, or try to maybe unravel some of them with antitrust lawsuits? Which Donald Trump started some of those lawsuits. Biden is pursuing them. So if you're a big company, one of those two guys is going to win, and they both don't like you. So to me, it seems like the biggest economic issue of our time, of the next 20 years, maybe of our kids' time, is this battle over bigness. We have said for 50 years, if not longer, bigger is better when it comes to U.S. corporations in terms of competition overseas and, and scale and all that sort of stuff. Now it seems like we're saying, wait, these big companies have too much power, and that even Republicans are saying consolidated economic power is as bad or worse than government power. And that's an amazing change.
The bigness point is also interesting, I think, because when you look at who's being targeted, it's so much Silicon Valley. It's these tech giants who themselves sort of have a political valence. And certainly you see the Republicans who are focused on this much more focused on a Google or an Amazon or a Facebook than on pick your industrial conglomerate, let's say.
Well, I think they get more attention, but I think there's still, there's bills out there, one by Chuck Grassley to go after the meatpacking and the poultry industries. This is a tiny one, but Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee is going after Ticketmaster because, that's her home state, home state interest. So there are other ones out there. I mean, I hear Republicans all the time talk about Republicans, that is, not Democrats. Republicans say, why are there only a handful of banks? Smaller banks can't compete with big banks because of all the red tape that it takes to become a too big to fail bank. And that's that's an issue that maybe even more traditional Republicans could get behind. The fact that some of these companies don't view Washington as the enemy the way they did in the 1980s or 1970s, but as an ally or a friend, or really a marketplace advantage. As in, if you can make the rules and regulations big enough and arduous enough and expensive enough to comply with, no one can compete with you. And so the big remain big. And that's how we are on Wall Street, certainly, that those Wall Street companies can afford to comply with the regulations, and therefore no one can compete with that.
Is there an element of just campaign finance changes really potentially driving this in maybe a sustainable way? I mean, you highlight the fact that, corporate PACs are playing a much less influential role, particularly on the Republican side, more small dollar donors. I said a minute ago, big business is ultimately going to be on some side, but I guess almost like, in the mid-century period when they weren't as much as a factor, you could hypothetically envision a world where big business just can't swing votes the way populists with small dollar donors can. Is that Is that plausible, or is that something the guy in the Occupy Wall Street tent
No,
thinks?
I think that you're right. And I think the best example is the 2016 presidential election. No one in Washington wanted Donald Trump to win that election. Not Republican, companies and Democrats were for Hillary Clinton. Republicans obviously hate the Clintons, but the establishment Republicans didn't want Donald Trump. They wanted any of those other 9 candidates running. He was the last person they wanted because he represented a disruption to to the establishment. If you go back and look at campaign donations from that time, all the big companies gave all their money to Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump didn't get any money from corporate America and was supported by very few CEOs. And they all thought that it helped. They all thought that he was going to lose and Hillary was going to win. And he won. And that demonstrates right there that democracy works, because even though Donald Trump didn't have the money, didn't have the backing, didn't have the support of the establishment, he had the support of the people. And I think even Democrats in Washington who hate Donald Trump have to respect that. In that regard, I think the process worked. And so,
Yeah.
so how, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say it's I guess there are a few things going on. One is the fundraising dimension. Another, it seems to me, is the communications element and just the ways in which politicians can hear from and communicate with constituents. You see, Trump in essence, and increasingly, I think the more anti-corporate segment of the Republican Party really making a point of just making an end run around the media as well. And essentially saying you can spend as many billions of dollars as you want against us, but if people vote for us, we still win, in essence.
Yeah, I think in a way, politics, the media, campaign finance are all becoming more democratized, and that's not a bad thing. I think a lot of us in Washington, yell and scream at that because we used to have the power. The power used to be consolidated in the establishment, and the establishment was Republicans and Democrats, and everyone in Washington was winning. And now people are complaining because people in Washington are losing the power. I say we, as in because I'm in Washington, but people in Washington are losing that power as it's being taken back by the people, which in a democracy is a good thing.
That's certainly true. And I guess it's useful, though, to separate, as we were talking about these different roles that lobbyists play. There is the sort of direct cash, campaign cash for support relationship. It seems to me, even in the long run, though, the sort of lobbyists are the experts element persists. That is, that the people can vote for whoever they want, but once they get to DC, you still have the same people at lunch. And this is a topic we actually spent a lot of time on in certainly American Compass. Folks interested in stuff like industrial policy think about a lot, because one of the concerns with industrial policy is so-called industry capture. That, at the end of the day, the semiconductor lobby is going to be writing the CHIPS Act and so on and so forth. And it seems to me, there are ways that that's bad. There are also ways, though, to your point about, you had a certain set of corporations and ideology driving policymaking, that if you're always going to have lobbyists, you at least in a sense, you want to have better interests. That is, I'd much rather have lobbyists for the steel makers and the semiconductor companies and so on and so forth in people's ears, instead of just the lobbyists for the banks and the tech companies and everybody who wants to offshore stuff to China. Is that a reasonable bet? Is there a sort of faction against faction just within the business world that can play out better than it has in the past?
So, yes. So, let's go back to the point that a member of Congress exists to get reelected. So, yes, the lobbyists are the experts and they're helping to explain legislation, but a member of Congress is not going to vote for something that is against what they believe is the interests of their consumers, of their constituents. So, if a member of Congress thinks that 51% of their constituents are for a free trade bill with Mexico, they're going to support it no matter how many corporate lobbyists say the opposite. So I think that even though lobbyists are outgunning and outmanning the other side on Capitol Hill, if a member thinks their constituents are for something, that's where they're going to be. To the second part of your question, yes, lobbying now is lots of company against company or industry against industry. where, a good example is Section 230 and the Decency Act, where
Communications.
Communications Act, sorry, where Google, Amazon, Facebook are lobbying against that. There are different degrees of variations within those companies, and they're trying to shape that whatever happens with a rewrite, if it happens, in a way that helps themselves and hurts their competitors, even within the tech world. So it's not like all tech companies are against that. They sort of different levels where they're just manipulating the system. They're doing exactly what like companies should not be doing, in textbooks, or instead of battling in the free market, they're coming to Washington to try to like create rules and regulations that hurt the other guy and help them. And that happens all the time. Within banks, within airlines, a great example a couple of years ago in the airline industry where Delta was lobbying against a new FAA rules that would make like computerized plane landings and make things more efficient. And Delta didn't want that because they generally use older airplanes that it would cost them a lot more money to retrofit all their planes with the right communication system. So, but meanwhile, United and some of the U.S. airlines that had newer planes were pushing this because it would screw over Delta. It was all sort of a warped view of how the free market should work.
Yes, although I guess it is how politics works. So I do want to ask you about any solutions or reforms in respect to this. But before that, one other question that I'm very interested in is foreign influence, which seems like it has become much more pervasive, even just in more recent years, not so much back to the 1980s. And it's something, frankly, that those of us working in Washington just sort of hear about a lot in off-the-record conversations. There's a lot of, oh, you wouldn't believe how much this or that is affecting this and that. Is that right in your opinion? How big a piece of the story is that at this point?
It is 100% true that foreign countries, particularly those in the Middle East, are spending a ton of money, investing a ton of money in Washington, in sports arenas, in restaurants, in real estate, and in lobbyists. I don't know exactly how influential those countries are. I think that, any member of Congress is, for, the old USA number one, but, they are sort of creating the appearance that, they are good allies of the U.S. when it comes to terrorism around the world. But I sort of don't get a sense of like what exactly the goal is. I mean, it's not like they're pushing legislation. It just seems a little sneaky. Like you're spending a lot of money in Washington. What do you really want? And they haven't really said that yet. So it's a little scary to me. But as you know, also, I mean, they're donating tons of money to think tanks and to public policy groups. And those think tanks and public policy groups can't take hard stances against some of those countries for human rights or, other abuses because they get all this money. And that seems problematic also. But in terms of their influence actually in Congress and in the government, I don't see it playing out very strongly right now.
Yeah, and I guess, but beyond the Middle East, China is the other example where obviously their TikTok efforts have not proved especially effective. In fact, many of them seemed quite ham-handed and counterproductive. But it does seem like there is a sort of explicit element of Chinese foreign policy, in essence, which is to attempt to influence U.S. government directly using a lot of money. I think the sort of Tony Podesta example as one that just in general with relationships, here you had one of the most prominent lobbyists, certainly in no need of money, but ending up in quite compromised relationships with a number of foreign governments. I guess I'd wonder, is that still the sort of one-off headline grabbing scandal, or is that more becoming the way business is done?
I actually think it's still a little more one-off. I mean, foreign governments spend a ton of money lobbying in Washington, but it's nothing compared to what corporations are spending. And there's only a small group of lobbyists, including Tony Podesta, who will work for some foreign governments. I mean, think about it. If you represent Saudi Arabia or Qatar or some country that is, controversial, has a bad human rights record, and then turn around and want to represent, AT&T or Pepsi. Those companies have a huge, so they do tons of work trying to protect their brand. And so they're not going to allow that to happen, which means that there's just not that many lobbyists who are willing to represent some of those countries. So, even though it's a lot of money, it's still, in my opinion, relatively small.
Interesting. All right. So what is to be done, as a good Marxist asks?
Right.
You mentioned the First Amendment, of course.
And I don't want to sit here and say the First Amendment, that's the problem, especially as a journalist. But a lot of what we're talking about is constitutionally protected. As a reporter, I think that I am obligated to say, and that's probably true also, that more disclosure would be helpful. We have regular, traditional, disclosed lobbyists who have to register and file quarterly disclosure statements that says, here are the companies I work for, here's how much money they pay me, here are the laws and regulations that I'm lobbying on their behalf on. But then you have people who are lobbying out in the states or are running campaigns to get constituents to support a trade bill or an abortion ban or something like that. Those people are not disclosed at all. So there's a lot of lobbying that takes place outside, in the shadows. I think more disclosure there would help, but I don't think it would solve a problem. This is sort of a controversial idea that maybe I'm the only person in the world who supports, but we've created a campaign finance system where the political parties and the candidates are limited in how much money they can receive. You can only get a member of Congress can only get $5,000 a year from a PAC, or $2,700 or $3,300 or something from an individual. A political party can only receive so much. But on the outside, these outside groups can spend millions of dollars on campaign ads for or against a member of Congress. Individuals and companies and unions can give them unlimited amounts of money, and some of that's not even disclosed. So it seems like let's either get more disclosure there or have less restrictions on the political parties. I mean, we live in a world right now where the Republican and Democratic parties are playing politics with one or maybe both hands tied behind their back. And it seems like no matter which party you support, the political party should be the strongest voice in our campaign outside of candidates themselves. And right now they're not. I feel like that's a problem.
So the more money rather than less solution.
Like I said, no one's going to support me on that one, but it's one way of doing it. Like, let's make this a fair fight. Why are the billionaires allowed to do whatever they want, and the political parties, which again are regulated and disclosed, can't? That doesn't seem fair.
Well, and you see it even with respect to candidates themselves right now. If you have $1 billion of your own, you can spend whatever you want. But if a friend of yours has $1 billion, that's not good enough. And so it creates some really odd asymmetries, I guess.
I agree. And take it one step further. If you're running for Congress, if someone were to run for Congress, you basically can't have a job. So you need to be self-made, you need to be a millionaire, you need to have the resources to make it a year or two with no income. So what types of people are running for Congress? That's certainly not the average American in both political parties. This is not a Republican or Democratic thing. Like, you have to have resource or be independently wealthy to run for Congress.
And what about in Congress? Do you think the sort of building up more competence within congressional staff and committees, helping more people who are not corporate lobbyists get in or have their voices heard, is that an element of it?
I feel like there's another easy solution here that'll never happen. I mean, if you pay congressional staffers $1 million a year and pay members of Congress $5 million a year, you're going to get the best and the brightest who, instead of wanting to work as a lobbyist, will go want to work on Capitol Hill. Now let's go to Capitol Hill and go to the American people and try to pass a bill to give $1 million pay raise to members of Congress. That's not going to happen. But, it actually might solve the problem, because you have staffers who aren't like immediately looking to leave as soon as they get to Capitol Hill. They want to stay. And if you stay for 20 years or 10 years, you're going to be an expert. You're going to know more about how to make policy, and you won't need to rely on lobbyists as much.
Yeah, we could probably fund the whole thing with a surcharge on corporate lobbying expenditures. Now we're talking. Well, we will reserve that for the sequel.
Exactly.
Brody Mullins, thank you so much. This has been terrific.
Thanks for having me. A lot of fun.
Brody Mullins, investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal and author with his brother of The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. That is all for this episode. We will be back again soon with more on the American Compass podcast. Thanks for listening.